Traditions and Encounters, A Brief Global History, 4th edition by McGraw-Hill. Part 2, bringing it all together, the formation of classical societies circa 500 BCE to 500 CE. In Part 2, we have seen that the classical societies that developed in Persia, China, India, and the Mediterranean built on many of the traditions established by the early complex societies discussed in Part 1. By the last half millennium BCE, however, the classical societies had surpassed their predecessors in complexity, organization, and sophistication. As a result, they were able to expand further to control many more people and resources and to trade longer distances than any human societies in the past. The increased reach of classical societies created an ever stronger need for the rulers to impose their will efficiently across long distances, especially when their territories included diverse and potentially rebellious conquered peoples. Some, like the Achaemenid dynasty of Persia, established carefully designed administrations that divided oversight of their wide realms into manageable portions headed by loyal administrators, many including the Achaemenids, the Romans, and the Han dynasty of China, standardized systems of law and taxation as a means of encouraging uniformity throughout their realms. Others, like the rulers of Han China, established a uniform educational system from which all imperial administrators would be drawn. Classical rulers also sought to impose their will and to promote unity within their realms by sponsoring particular philosophies, cultural practices, or religious beliefs. Thus, Greeks encouraged a sense of commonality between the diverse polis and colonies by sponsoring the Olympic Games. In India, the Mauryan dynasty advocated Buddhism as a unifying system of belief. The Persian Sassanids sponsored Zoroastrianism as a state religion, and the Romans actively promoted Christianity after 380 CE. Finally, all the classical societies sought to increase the efficiency of their administrations by establishing long-distance transportation and communication networks. While these networks aided imperial administration, they also allowed for a dramatic increase in long-distance trade. In turn, long-distance trade encouraged both the spread of religions such as Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity, as well as the diffusion of disease pathogens that ultimately contributed to the disintegration of the classical societies. By 500 CE, classical societies in Persia, China, India, and the Mediterranean basin had either collapsed or fallen into decline. Yet all the classical societies left rich legacies that shaped political institutions, social orders, and cultural traditions for centuries to come. Moreover, by sponsoring commercial and cultural relations between different peoples, the classical societies laid a foundation for intensive and systematic cross-cultural interaction in later times. Here's the chart. Part 3, the post-classical era, 500 C to 1000 CE. I'm so sorry. The post-classical era was a period of a major readjustment for societies throughout the Eastern Hemisphere. During the early centuries CE, disease as well as both internal and external pressures brought serious instability to classical societies in China, India, Southwest Asia, and the Mediterranean basin. Most of the classical empires collapsed under the strain during the post-classical era. The settled societies of Eastern Hemisphere underwent political, social, economic, and cultural change that would shape their experiences over the long term. Restoring order. The first task that settled societies faced in the post-classical era was the need to restore political and social order. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the eastern half of the Roman Empire survived as the Byzantine. This is a painting, sculpture. Byzantine Empire, but underwent political and social reorganization in order to deal with external pressures in Southwest Asia. Arab conquerors, inspired by the recently founded Islamic faith, asserted their authority over vast areas in Southwest Asia and North Africa, and introduced their faith to India, as well as Iberia. In China, the Sui and Tang dynasties restored centralized imperial authority after almost 4 centuries of rule by competing regional kingdoms and nomadic conquerors. In India, in contrast, centralized imperial rule did not return. Authority devolved instead to a series of regional kingdoms. Economic growth. The reestablishment of political and social order enabled post-classical societies to revive networks of long-distance trade and participate more actively in processes of cross-cultural communication and exchange. As a result, the post-classical era was a time of rapid economic growth in most of the Eastern Hemisphere. Meanwhile, increased trade facilitated biological and technological, as well as commercial exchanges. Agricultural crops migrated far beyond the lands of their origin, and improved techniques of irrigation and cultivation spread through much of Eurasia. As agricultural production increased, so did human population, which allowed growing numbers of people to devote their efforts to trade and manufacturing rather than cultivation. The spread of religious traditions. The post-classical era was also crucially important for the formation and development of cultural and religious traditions. Islam first appeared during the post-classical era, and it soon became the foundation of an expansive empire stretching from North Africa to northern India. Buddhism expanded beyond the Indian subcontinent and Central Asia, attracting converts in East and Southeast Asia. Christianity was the official faith of the Byzantine Empire, where the Eastern Orthodox Church emerged and gave shape to a distinctive form of Christianity that eventually spread to much of Eastern Europe and Russia. Legacies of the post-classical era. The empires and regional states of the post-classical era disappeared long ago, but the social and economic and cultural legacies of the age are noticeable even today. Most notable, perhaps, religious and cultural traditions continue to flourish in lands where they first attracted converts in post-classical times. In some ways, then, the post-classical age survives even in the modern world. Chapter 10. The Christian Commonwealth of the Byzantine. Eyewitness. According to the Byzantine historians Procopius, 2 Christian monks from Persia set out on a momentous journey about the middle of the 6th century CE. The result of their travels was introduced of high-quality silk production to the Eastern Mediterranean. Although local craft workers had long produced coarse fabrics from the cocoons of wild silkworms, fine silks had come to the Mediterranean only from China, where manufacturers closely guarded both their carefully bed strains of silkworms and the complex technology that yielded high-quality textiles. Mediterranean consumers obtained silk not directly from Chinese producers, but rather through intermediaries subject to the Sassanid Empire of Persia. According to Procopius' account, the 2 Christian monks observed the technique of silk production during the course of a mission into China. Upon departure, they hollowed out their walking staffs and filled them with silkworm eggs, which they smuggled out of China through their native land of Persia and into the Byzantine Empire. The monks' motives are unknown, whatever they may have been, though it is certain that the monks by themselves could not have introduced a full-blown silk industry to Byzantium. The production of fine Chinese-style silks required more than a few silkworm eggs. It also required understanding sophisticated technologies and elaborate procedures that must have reached the Byzantine Empire by several different routes. Thus, it seems that Procopius simplified a much more complex story. In any case, Byzantine craft workers did indeed learn how to produce high-quality silk fabrics. By the late 6th century, Byzantine silks matched Chinese silks in quality. Mediterranean consumers can no longer relied on Chinese producers and Persian intermediaries, and local production of high-quality silk greatly strengthened the Byzantine economy. Thus, Procopius' anonymous monks participated in a momentous transfer of technology between distant lands. Their effort contributed to the vibrance of Byzantine society, and their story highlights the significance of cross-cultural interactions during the post-classical era. During the centuries after 200 CE, most of the classical societies faced a series of problems: epidemic disease, declining populations, economic contraction, social and political turmoil, and military threats that brought about their collapse. Only in the Eastern Mediterranean did a classical empire survive. The eastern half of the Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, withstood the various problems that brought down other classical societies and survived for almost a millennium after the collapse of Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE. And the Byzantine Empire did not reconstitute the larger Mediterranean society of classical times. The Roman Empire had dominated an integrated Mediterranean basin. The Byzantine Empire mostly faced a politically and culturally fragmented Mediterranean region. After 7th century CE, Islamic states controlled lands to the east and south of the Mediterranean. Slavic peoples dominated lands to the north, and Western Europeans organized increasingly powerful states in lands to the west. Nevertheless, the Byzantine Empire was a political and economic powerhouse of the post-classical era. Until the 20th century, Byzantine authority dominated the wealthy and productive Eastern Mediterranean region. Manufactured goods from the Byzantine Empire enjoyed a reputation for high quality in markets from the Mediterranean basin to India. The Byzantine Empire also deeply influenced the historical development of the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe and Russia by introducing writing, Christianity, codified law, and sophisticated political organization into their lands. Because Byzantine political, economic, and cultural influence stretched so far, historians often refer to it as the Byzantine Commonwealth. Just as Greek and Roman initiative brought Mediterranean lands into a larger integrated society during classical times, Byzantine policies led to the formation of a large multicultural zone of trade, communication, interaction, and exchange in Eastern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean basin during the post-classical era. The early Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire takes its name from Byzantine, Latinized as Byzantium, a modest village that occupied a site of enormous strategic significance, situated on a defensible peninsula and blessed with a magnificent natural harbor known as the Golden Horn. Byzantine had the potential to control the Bosporus, the strait of water leading from the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, and beyond to the Dardanelles, the Aegean Sea, and the Mediterranean. Apart from its maritime significance, the Byzantine also offered convenient access to the rich lands of Anatolia, southwestern Asia, and southeastern Europe. Because of its strategic value, the Roman Empire Constantine designated Byzantine as the site of new imperial capital, which he named Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The imperial government moved to Constantinople in 340 CE, and the new capital rapidly reached metropolitan dimensions. By the late 4th century, it was the most important political and military center of the Eastern Roman Empire, and it soon became the dominant economic and commercial center in the Eastern Mediterranean basin. The city kept its name Constantinople until 1453 CE, when it fell to the Ottoman Turks, who renamed it Istanbul. By convention, however, historians refer to the realm governed from Constantinople between the 5th and 15th century CE as the Byzantine Empire, or simply as Byzantine in honor of the original settlement. The later Roman Empire and Byzantine. The Byzantine Empire originated as the eastern half of the classical Roman Empire, which survived the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE. In its early days, the Byzantine Empire embraced Greece, the Balkan region, Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and northeast Africa during the 7th and 8th century CE. However, the southern regions of the empire fell into the hands of the Arab Muslim conquerors. Nevertheless, Byzantine figured as a major power of the Eastern Mediterranean basin until the 13th century CE. The later Roman Empire. As the Western Empire crumbled, the eastern half of the empire remained intact, complete with the roads, communications, lines of authority, and a set of functioning imperial institutions, all inherited from Roman predecessors. Yet the early Byzantine emperors faced challenges different from those of their predecessors, and they built a state significantly different from the classical Roman Empire. The principal challenges that confronted the late Roman and early Byzantine empires were the consolidation of the dynamic Sassanid dynasty 226 to 641 CE in Persia, and the invasion of the migratory peoples from the north and east. The Sassanid emperors sought to rebuild the Achaemenid Empire of the classical Persia, a goal that brought them into conflict with Roman forces in Mesopotamia and Syria. Germanic invasions also menaced the late Roman Empire because they did not have adequate resources to respond strongly to the threats on all fronts. Roman authorities concentrated on maintaining the integrity of wealthy eastern portion of the empire. The early Byzantine state. The Byzantine emperors built a distinctive tradition of statecraft. Its most important feature was tightly centralized rule that concentrated power in the hands of a highly exalted emperor. This characteristic was already noticeable in the time of Constantine, who built his new capital to lavish standards. He filled it with the libraries, museums, and artistic treasures, and he constructed magnificent marble structures, excuse me, all in an effort to create a new Roman fit for the ruler of a mighty empire. Caesaropapism, excuse me, let's try that again. Caesaropapism. Constantine also set a precedent by hedging his rule with an aurora of divinity. Although he did not claim divine status, and some of his imperial predecessors had as the first Christian emperor, he did claim divine favor and sanction for his rule. He intervened in theological disputes and used his political position to support views that he considered orthodox, and condemned those who he regarded as heretical. Constantine initiated a policy that historians call Caesar-propism, whereby the empire not only ruled as a secular lord, but also played an active and prominent role in ecclesiastical affairs. Particularly after the 6th century, Byzantine emperors became absolute rulers. According to the Roman laws, emperors stood above the law theoretically. They wielded absolute authority in political, military, judicial, financial, and religious. Here is the map. Do you want to look at that? Matters. They also enjoyed the services of a large and complex bureaucracy. In combination, law and bureaucracy produced an exceptionally centralized state. The Byzantine court. Even dress and court etiquette drew attention to the lofty status of Byzantine rulers. The emperors wore heavily bejeweled crowns and dressed in magnificent silk robes, dyed a dark, rich purple, a color reserved strictly for imperial use. High officials presented themselves to the emperor as slaves, and before taking up matters of business, prostrated themselves before him 3 times and kissed his hands and feet. By the 10th century, engineers had contrived a series of mechanical devices that worked dazzling effects and impressed foreign envoys at their Byzantine court. Mechanical lions roared and swished their tails as ambassadors approached the emperor, and sometimes the imperial throne itself moved up and down to emphasize the awesome splendor of the emperor. Justinian and his legacy. Justinian and Theodora. The most important of the early Byzantine emperors was Justinian, 527 to 565 CE, an energetic and tireless worker known to his subjects as the Sleepless Emperor, who profoundly influenced the development of the Byzantine Empire with the aid of his ambitious wife Theodora. Both were intelligent, strong-willed, and disciplined, and used those qualities to build a strong empire and a grand imperial court. Like Constantine, Justinian lavished resources on the imperial capital during the early years of his rule. Riots against high taxes had destroyed much of Constantinople after Theodore persuaded him to deploy the imperial army and quash the disturbances. Justinian embarked on an ambitious construction program that thoroughly remade the city. The most notable building erected during that campaign was the Church of Hagia Sophia, a magnificent dome structure that ranks as one of the world's most important examples of Christian architecture. Visitors marveled at the church's enormous dome, which they likened to the heavens encircling the earth, and they expressed awe at the gold, silver, and gems that are decorated and illuminated Hagia Sophia. Over time, the church even acquired a reputation for working miraculous cures. Its columns and doors reportedly healed the illness of people who stood beside them or touched them. Here is a picture of the Emperor Justinian. And here is a picture of the church, interior heights at the Hagia Sophia. Justinian Code. Justinian's most significant political contribution was his codification of Roman law. Almost immediately on taking the throne, Justinian ordered a thorough and systematic review of Roman law. On the basis of that work, he issued a Corpus Iuris Civilis, body of the civil law, which immediately won recognition as definitive work. Later emperors updated Roman law by abiding new provisions, but Justinian's code continued to serve as a source of legal inspiration and went on to influence civil law codes throughout much of Western Europe. Belisarius, and Byzantine conquests. Justinian's most ambitious venture was his effort to reconquer the Western Roman Empire and Germanic peoples and reestablish Roman authority throughout the Mediterranean basin. Beginning in 533, he sent his brilliant general Belisarius on military campaigns that returned Italy, Sicily, northwestern Africa, and southern Spain to imperial hands. By the end of his reign in 565, Justinian had reconstituted a good portion of the classical Roman Empire. Justinian's accomplishment, however, did not long survive his own rule. Byzantine simply did not possess the resources to sustain Belisarius' conquest. Although Byzantine managed to hold on to a few areas in the Italian peninsula, Justinian's dream of restoring Roman authority throughout the Mediterranean basin soon faded. Indeed, Justinian's efforts clearly showed that the classical Roman Empire was beyond recovery. While Justinian devoted his attention to the Western Mediterranean, the Sassanids threatened Byzantine from the east, and Slavic peoples approached from the north. Justinian's successors had no choice but to withdraw their resources from the Western Mediterranean and redeploy them in the east. Even though Belisarius' reconquest of the Western Roman Empire was a spectacular military accomplishment, it was also something of an anachronism, since the lands of the eastern and western Mediterranean had already begun to follow different historical trajectories. Islamic conquest and Byzantine revival. After the 7th century CE, the emergence of Islamic and the development of a powerful and expansive Islamic state, topics discussed in chapter 11, posed a serious challenge to Byzantine. Inspired by their Islamic faith, Arab peoples conquered the Sassanid Empire and overran Byzantine Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. During the late 7th century, or 7th and early 8th centuries, Islamic forces are even subjected Constantinople to prolonged siege in 674 through 678, and again in 717 to 718, Byzantine resisted this northern thrust of Islam party because the military technology. Byzantine forces used weapon known as Greek fire, a highly effective incendiary weapon whose ingredients were a stated secret that has since been lost, which they launched at both the fleets and the ground forces of the invaders. Greek fire burned even when floating on water, and thus created a serious hazard when deployed around wooden ships. On land, it caused panic among enemy forces because it was very difficult to extinguish and often burned troops to death. As a result of this defensive effort, the Byzantine Empire retained its hold on Anatolia, Greece, and Balkan region. Why is this? Imperial organization. There we go. Sometimes my phone does that, guys. I'm sorry. Though much reduced by the Islamic conquest, the Byzantine Empire after the 8th century was also more compact and manageable. Also, Byzantine rulers initiated a political and social adjustments that strengthened the empire that remained in their hands. The most important innovation was the reorganization of Byzantine society under the theme Imperial province system. This system placed a theme under the jurisdiction of a general who assumed responsibility for both its military defense and its civil administration. Generals received their appointments from the imperial government, which closely supervised. Oh gosh, why does it keep doing this? Generals received their appointments from the imperial government, which closely supervised their activities to prevent decentralization of power and authority. Generals recruited armies from the ranks of free peasants who received allotments of land in exchange for military service. The armies proved to be effective military forces, and the system as a whole strengthened the class of free peasants, which in turn solidified Byzantine agricultural economy. The theme system enabled Byzantine forces to mobilize quickly and resist further Islamic advances, and also undergirded the political order and the social organization of the empire from the 8th through the 12th century. Indeed, Byzantine variety expanded its influence between the late 9th and late 11th centuries. During the 10th century, Byzantine forces shored up defenses in Anatolia and reconquered Syria from Arab Muslims. During the reign of the Basil II, 976 to 1025 CE, known as the Basil of the Bulgar Slayer, Byzantine armies turned west and crushed the neighboring Bulgars, who had built a large kingdom in the Balkans. After his victory at the Battle of the Cleton in 1014 CE, Basil reportedly commanded his forces to blind 14,000 Bulgarian survivors. Though he spared 14,000 Bulgarian survivors, oh my gosh, one eye in a few, who then guided the others home. By the mid-11th century, the Byzantine Empire embraced lands from Syria and Armenia in the east to southern Italy in the west, from the Danube River in the north to Cyprus and Crete in the south. Byzantine expansion brought in so much wealth that Basil was able to waive the collection of taxes for 2 years. Once again, Byzantine dominated the eastern Mediterranean. Let me go ahead and focus that so you can see the manuscript illustration of the fire weapon. Byzantine and Western Empire. Tensions between Byzantine and Western European states. While they went to war with their Arab, Muslim, and pagan Slavic neighbors, Byzantine also experienced tense relations with their Christian counterparts in the Western Mediterranean. The Christian Church of Constantinople conducted its affairs in Greek and was heavily influenced by the will of the Caesar Rapist. I cannot pronounce that word to save my life today, sorry. Emperors, whereas the Christian Church of Rome conducted its affairs and in Latin and rejected imperial interferences in eco-celestial matters. Church authorities in Byzantine regarded Roman Christians as poorly educated and uncouth. In return, church leaders in Rome considered their Byzantine counterparts insincere and insufficiently wary of heresy. Political grievances also strained relations between Byzantine and Western European lands. During the 5th and 6th centuries, imperial authorities could do little more than watch as the Germanic peoples established successor states to the Western Roman Empire, lands that Byzantine emperors regarded as their rightful inheritance. Worse yet, some of the upstart powers claimed imperial authority for themselves. In 800, for example, the Frankish ruler Charlemagne received an imperial crown from the Pope in Rome, thereby directly challenging Byzantine claims to imperial authority over Western lands. Charlemagne's empire soon dissolved, but in 962, Otto of the Saxony urged his own claim to rule as emperor over the western lands of the former Roman Empire. Adding injury to insult, Otto then attacked lands in southern Italy that had been in Byzantine possession since the days of Justinian's. Here's the picture. Sorry, that was my cup. Byzantine economy and society. Byzantine dominated the political and military affairs of the Eastern Mediterranean, largely because of its strong economy. Ever since classical times, the territories embraced by the Byzantine Empire had produced abundant agricultural surpluses, supported a large number of craft workers, and participated in trade with lands throughout the Mediterranean. Even after the collapse of the Roman Empire, those territories continued to provide a solid material foundation for Byzantium, and they helped to make the Byzantine Empire an economic powerhouse of post-classical era. Rural economy and society. Until its conquest by Arab forces, Egypt was the major source of grain for Byzantium. Afterward, Anatolia and the lower Danube region served as the imperial breadbasket. All those lands produced reliable and abundant harvests of wheat, which supported large populations in Byzantium's major cities. Indeed, between the 5th and early 13th centuries, Constantinople's population alone approached or exceeded 1 million people. The peasantry. Byzantine economy and society were the strongest when the empire supported a large class of free peasants who owned small plots of lands. Besides serving as the backbone of the Byzantine military system, free peasants cultivated their land intensively in the hopes of improving their families' fortunes. As in other societies, however, wealthy families sought to accumulate land and to control the labor of peasants for their own interest. Especially in the early centuries of the Byzantine Empire, wealthy cultivators worked to bind the peasants to their estates or to force them into sharecropping arrangements from which it was difficult to break free. However, the invasion of the 6th and 7th centuries broke up many large estates and afforded peasants an opportunity to rebuild small holdings. The theme system strengthened free peasantry by making land available to those who performed military service. The imperial government also made periodic efforts to prevent wealthy landowners from gaining control over peasant lands. Over the long term, however, wealthy landowners built ever larger estates. From the 11th century onward, they transformed the peasants into an increasingly dependent class, and by the 13th century, free peasants accounted for only a small portion of rural population. Decline of the free peasantry. The accumulation of land holdings in the hands of the wealthy had important implications for financial and military affairs. For one thing, large estates often received tax exemptions and so did not contribute their fair share to imperial coffers. Moreover, the decline of the free peasantry diminished the pool of recruits available for service in military forces organized under the theme system. Thus, concentration of land and rural resources worked against the financial interest of the central government, and it paused political, military, and economic difficulties for the Byzantine state during the last 3 centuries of its existence. Industry and trade. In spite of social and economic problems, Byzantine remained a wealthy land. Byzantine prosperity derived both from the empire's productive capacity and from the importance of Constantinople's center of trade, manufacturing enterprises. Indeed, Constantinople was home to many artisans and crafts workers who enjoyed a reputation, especially for their glassware, linen, and woolen textiles, gems, jewelry, and fine work in gold and silver. In addition, after the arrival of silkworms, workers added high-quality silk textiles to the list of products manufactured. In the Byzantine Empire, silk was a most important addition to the economy, and Byzantine became the principal supplier of this fashionable fabric to lands. In the Mediterranean basin, the silk industry was so important to the Byzantine economy that the government closely supervised every step in its production for sale. Regulations allowed individuals to participate only in one activity, such as weaving, dyeing, or sales, to prevent the creation of a monopoly in the industry by a few wealthy or powerful entrepreneurs. Trade. Situated astride routes going east and west, as well as north and south, Constantinople also served as the main clearinghouse for trade in the western part of Eurasia. The merchants of Constantinople manufactured direct commercial links with manufacturers and merchants in Central Asia, Russia, Scandinavia, Northern Europe, and the lands of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean basin. Byzantine dominated trade such as an extent that trading peoples recognized the Byzantine gold coin. The Byzant as the standard currency of the Mediterranean basin for more than half a millennium, from the 6th through the 12th century. Byzantine drew enormous wealth simply from the control of trade and levying of customs duties on merchandise that passed through its lands. More important, Byzantine served as the western anchor of a Eurasian trading network that received the silk roads of classical times. Silk and porcelain came to Constantinople from China, spices from India and Southeast Asia, carpets arrived from Persia, woolen textiles from Western Europe, and timber, furs, honey, amber, and slaves from Russia and Scandinavia. The organization of trade. I'm going to pause here so you guys can see that. Okay. The organization of trade banks helped to fuel Byzantine trade by advancing loans to individuals seeking to launch business ventures. And Byzantine merchants often formed partnerships that allowed them to pool their resources and limit their risks. Although neither banking nor partnership was an altogether new technique, Byzantine businessmen made much more extensive use of them than their predecessors had. In doing so, they supported and stimulated a dynamic commercial economy. I'm going to go ahead and do sources from the past so that you may pause this and read this at your leisure. Urban life. Constantinople had no rival among Byzantine cities. Subjects of the Byzantine Empire referred to it simply as the city. The heart of the city was the Imperial Palace, which employed 20,000 workers as a palace staff. Peacocks strutted through gardens filled with sculptures and fountains. Most famous was a gold fountain in the shape of a pineapple that sprouted wine for imperial guests. Housing Constantinople. Aristocrats maintained enormous palaces that included courtyards, reception halls, libraries, and chapels. Women lived in separate apartments and did not receive male visitors from outside the household. Indeed, women often did not participate in banquets and parties, especially when wine flowed freely or when the affairs were likely to become so festive that they could compromise a woman's honor. The less privileged classes of Constantinople occupied less splendid dwellings. Artisan and craft workers usually lived in rooms above their shops, and clerks and government officials lived in multi-story apartment buildings. Workers and the poor occupied dangerous and rickety tenements, sharing kitchens and sanitary facilities with their neighbors. Attractions of Constantinople. even for the poor, though the city had its attractions, as the heir to Rome and Constantinople was a city of baths, which were sites of relaxation and exercise as well as hygienic bathing. Taverns and restaurants offered settings for social gatherings. Chicken, chess, and dice games were especially popular activities at taverns. And theaters provided entertainment in the form of song, dance, and striptease. Mass entertainment took place in the Hippodrome, a large stadium adjacent to the Imperial Palace. There, Byzantine subjects watched chariot races, athletic matches, contests between wild animals, and circuses featuring clowns, jugglers, acrobats, and dwarfs. Classical heritage and Orthodox Christianity. The first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire gave his name and his faith to Constantinople. Like the Byzantine state, however, Byzantine Christianity developed along distinctive lines, and it became a faith different from the early Christianity of the Roman Empire. For one thing, the philosophy and literature of classical Greece had a much deeper influence in Byzantine than in Western Europe. Byzantine church leaders also disagreed with their Western counterparts on matters of doctrine, ritual, and church authority. By the mid-11th century, differences between the Eastern and Western churches had become so great that their leaders formally divided Mediterranean Christianity into the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. The legacy of classical Greece. Although local inhabitants spoke Greek, the official language of early Constantinople was Latin. The language of Rome after the 6th century, however, Greek replaced Latin as the language of government in the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine scholars often did not learn to read Latin, and they drew intellectual inspiration from the New Testament, originally composed in Greek, and the philosophy and literature of classical Greece rather than classical Rome. Byzantine education. The legacy of classical Greece was especially noticeable in the Byzantine education. The Byzantine state considered education vitally important, since its bureaucracy called for large numbers of literate individuals to administer the empire. As a result, the state organized a school system that offered a primary education in reading, writing, and grammar, followed by studies of classical Greek literature, philosophy, and science. Because of this, basic literacy was widespread in Byzantine society. Byzantine scholarship. Like the educational system, Byzantine scholarship reflected the cultural legacy of classical Greece. Byzantine scholars concentrated on the humanities, literature, history, and philosophy, rather than on the natural sciences or medicine. Byzantine, with a literary education, considered themselves the direct heirs of classical Greece, and they went to great lengths to preserve and transmit the classical legacy. Indeed, almost all literary and philosophical works of classical Greece that survive have come down to the present in copies made between the 10th and 12th centuries. In the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine Church and state. The most distinctive feature of the Byzantine Christianity was its close relationship with the imperial government. From time to time, the Constantine on Caesar Repapist emperors, I will not be able to read it, participated actively in religious and theological matters. In 325 CE, for example, Constantine organized the Council of Nicaea, which brought together bishops, spokesmen, and leaders from all the important Christian churches to consider the views of the Arians, who believed that Jesus had been a mortal human rather than a divine being co-eternal with God. Although Constantine originally favored Arian views, he came to accept the view that Jesus was both human and divine, and personally attended sessions of the Council of Nicaea to support it. His presence encouraged the council to endorse his preferred view as orthodox and to condemn Artinian Arianism as heresy. The Byzantine emperors, in fact, treated the church as a department of state. They appointed individuals to serve as Patriarch of Constantinople, the highest ecclesiastical office in the Byzantine Church, counterpart of the Pope in Rome. And they instructed patriarchs, bishops, and priests to deliver sermons that supported imperial policy. This sacerdotism was a source of constant conflict between imperial and ecclesiastical authorities, and sometimes even between emperors and their subjects. For example, Emperor Leo III reigned from 717 to 741 CE, sparked riots throughout the empire when he embraced a policy of iconoclasm, literally the breaking of icons, in an attempt to prohibit the use of religious images and icons in the churches. Although the policy was ultimately unsuccessful, it generated tremendous bitterness among ordinary people who were deeply attached to their religious imagery in their churches. Greek philosophy and Byzantine theology. In its theology, Byzantine Christianity reflected the continuing influence of classical Greek philosophy. Theologians invested a great deal of time and intellectual energy in the examination of religious questions from a philosophical point of view. They looked to classical philosophy, for example, when seeking to understand the nature of Jesus and the extent to which he possessed both humans and divine characteristics. Although these debates often became extremely technical, they illustrated an effort to understand Christian doctrine in light of the terms and concepts that the classical philosophers had employed in their analysis of the world. A school maintained by the Patriarch of Constantinople provided instruction for clergy and church officials in advanced theology of this sort. Thus, although it differed in many ways from Mediterranean society of classical times, Byzantine built its own cultural and religious traditions on a solid classical foundation. Monasticism, and a popular piety. Caesar-Repapist emperors, powerful patriarchs, and other high church officials concerned themselves with theological and ritual matters, and rarely dealt directly with the lay population of the Byzantine Church. Nor did the Byzantine laity have much interest in fine points of theology, and they positively resented policies such as iconoclasm that infringed on cherished patterns of worship. For religious inspiration, then, the laity looked not to the church hierarchy, but to the local monasteries. Asceticism. Byzantine monasticism grew out of the efforts of devout individuals to lead especially holy lives, drawing inspiration from early Christian ascetics in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Persia. These individuals observed regimes of extreme asceticism and self-denial. During the 5th century, for example, a few men and at least 2 women demonstrated their ascetic commitments by perching for years at a time atop tall pillars, Because of the extreme dedication of ascetics, disciples often gathered around them and established communities of men and women determined to follow their example. The communities became the earliest monasteries of the Byzantine Church. They had few rules until St. Basil of Caesarea, 329 to 379 CE, the Patriarch of Constantinople during the mid-4th century, urged them to give up their personal possessions and live communally, to observe the rule of elected superiors, and to devote themselves to work and prayer. After the 4th century, Byzantine monasterism spread rapidly throughout the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine monasterism, unlike their counterparts in Western Europe and other lands, Byzantine monasteries, for the most part, did not become centers of education, study, learning, and scholarship. Yet monasteries under the rule of St. Basil had a reputation for piety and devotion, and that endeared them to the Byzantine laity. Byzantine monks went to great lengths in search of mystical union with God through meditation and prayer. Some retired to remote destinations to lead lives of strict asceticism. The devotion of Byzantine monks, in turn, inspired piety among the Byzantine laity because they represented a religious faith more and meaningful than that of the theologians and ecclesiastical bureaucrats of Constantinople. Monks and nuns also provide social services to their communities. They provided spiritual counsel to local laity, and they organized relief efforts by bringing food and medical attention to communities struck by disasters. They won the support of the Byzantine populace too, when they vigorously opposed the policy of iconoclasm and fought to restore icons to churches and monasteries. Indeed, by setting examples of devotion and by tending to the needs of and interests of the laity, monks helped maintain support for their faith in the Byzantine Empire. Tensions between Eastern and Western Christianity. Byzantine Christianity developed in tension, particularly with the Christian faith of Western Europe. During the centuries following the Constantine's legalization of Christianity, church leaders in Jerusalem, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and Rome exercised great influence in the larger Christian community. Yet after the Arab peoples conquered most of Southwest Asia and introduced Islam in the 7th century, the influence of the patriarchs in Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Antioch declined, leaving only Constantinople and Rome as the principal centers of Christian authority. Constantinople and Rome. The specific issues that divided the two Christian communities in Constantinople and Rome were religious and theological. Some ritual and doctrinal differences were relatively major concerns over forms of worship and the precise wording of theological teachings. Byzantine theologians objected, for example, to the fact that Western priests shaved their beards and used unleavened instead of leavened bread. When saying Mass, other differences concerning substantive theological matters such as the precise relationship between God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. Schism. Alongside these ritual and doctrinal differences, the Byzantine patriarchs and Roman popes disputed their respective rights and powers. Patriarchs argued that for the autonomy of all major Christian jurisdictions, including that of Constantinople, whereas popes asserted the primacy of Rome as the sole set of authority for all Christianity. Ultimately, relations became so strained that the Eastern and Western churches went separate ways. In 1054 CE, the Patriarch and the Pope excommunicated each other, each refusing to recognize the other's church as properly Christian Despite efforts of reconciliation, the resulting schism between Eastern and Western churches persists to the present day. In recognition of this split, historians refer to the Eastern Christian Church after 1054 AD, or 1054, as the Eastern Orthodox Church and its Western counterpart of the Roman Catholic Church. The influence of the Byzantine in Eastern Europe. By the second millennium CE, a dynamic society founded on the Islamic faith had seized control of the lands on the Mediterranean south and eastern rims, and Byzantines and Western Europeans contested the northern rim. Hemmed in and increasingly pressured by Islamic and Western European societies, Byzantine entered a period of decline beginning about the late 11th century. As the Mediterranean influence waned, however, Byzantine turned its attention to Eastern Europe and Russia through political, commercial, and cultural relations. Byzantine decisively influenced the history of the Slavic peoples. The Byzantine state itself came to an end in the 15th century CE. But because the Byzantine Commonwealth, the larger collection of societies in Eastern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean basin that developed under Byzantine influences, the legacy of Byzantine survives and continues to shape the lives of millions of people in Russia and Eastern Europe. Domestic problems and foreign pressures. When Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, died in 1025 CE, the Byzantine Empire was a politically, military, and economic dynamo. Within 50 years, however, the empire was suffering from serious internal weakness and had endured a series of military reverses. Both domestic and foreign problems helped to explain this decline. Social problems. Domestic problems arose, ironically, from the successor of the theme system. Generals who governed the themes were natural allies of local aristocrats who held large tracts of land, and together they began to resist the policies of the imperial government. At times, they even mounted rebellions against the central authorities. Moreover, by a mid-century, aristocrats had accumulated vast estates that placed free peasantry under increasing pressure. Since peasants provided the backbone of Byzantine military system and agricultural economy, this caused both fiscal and military problems for the imperial government. You can read Thinking About Encounters. There we go. Challenges from the West. As domestic problems mounted, Byzantine also faced fresh foreign challenges from the West and Normans, a Scandinavian people who had seized and settled in Normandy, in northern France, during the early 11th century. They established themselves as an independent power in southern Italy, and by mid-century they had taken control of southern Italy and expelled Byzantine authorities there. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the Normans and other Western European peoples mounted a series of crusades, vast military campaigns intended to recapture of Jerusalem and other sites holy to Christians from Muslims, and took the opportunity to carve out states in the heart of the Byzantine Empire. They even conquered and sacked Constantinople in 1204. Although Byzantine forces recaptured the capital in 1261, the destruction of Constantinople dealt the Byzantine Empire a blow from which it never completely recovered. Challenges from the East. As Europeans expanded into Byzantine territory from the West, nomadic Turkish peoples invaded from the East. Most important among them were the Muslim Seljuks, who, beginning in 11th century, sent waves of invaders into Anatolia. Given the military and financial problems of the Byzantine Empire, the Seljuks found Anatolia ripe for plunder. In 1071, they subjected the Byzantine Empire army to demoralizing defeat at the Battle of Manzikert. Byzantine factions then turned one on another in civil war, allowing the Seljuks almost free reign in Anatolia. By the late 12th century, the Seljuks had seized much of Anatolia, and crusaders from Western Europe held most of the remainder. The loss of Anatolia, the principal source of Byzantine grain, wealth, and military forces, sealed fate of the Byzantine Empire. A territorially truncated Byzantine survived until the mid-15th century, but the late Byzantine Empire enjoyed little autonomy and continually faced fresh challenges from Italian merchants, Western Europeans, adventurers, and Turkish nomads. In 1453, after a long era of decline, the Byzantine Empire came to an end when Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople and absorbed its territories into their own expanding realm. Here's the map of, let me see if I can try and close up the, oh no, I'm so sorry. So here's the conversion. Let's see if I can get an overall. Early relations between Byzantine and Slavic people. By the time Constantinople fell, Byzantine traditions had deeply influenced the political and cultural development of Slavic peoples. In Eastern Europe and Russia, close relations between Byzantine and Slavic peoples dates from the 6th century, when Justinian deployed Byzantine's military resource in the Western Mediterranean. Slavic people from the north took advantage of the opportunity to move into Byzantine territory. Serbs and Croats moved into the Balkan Peninsula, and Bulgars established a powerful kingdom in the lower Danube region. Relations between the Byzantine and Bulgaria were especially tense by the 8th century. However, Byzantine had begun to influence Bulgarian politics and society. Byzantine and Bulgaria entered into political, commercial, and cultural relations. Members of the Bulgarian ruling families often went to Constantinople for a formal education in Greek language and literature, and followed Byzantine examples in organizing their court and capital. Cyril and Methodists. Byzantine also sent missionaries to Balkan lands, and Bulgars and other Slavic peoples began to convert to Orthodox Christianity. The most famous of the missionaries to the Slav and the saints Cyril and Methodius, two brothers from the Thessaloniki in Greece. During mid-19th century, Cyril and Methodius conducted missions to Bulgaria and Moravia, which included much of the modern Czech, Slovakian, and Hungarian territories. While there, they devised an alphabet known as the Cyrillic alphabet for the previously illiterate Slavic peoples. Though adapted from written Greek, the Cyrillic alphabet represented the sounds of Slavic languages more precisely than did the Greek, and it remained in use in much of Eastern Europe until supplanted by the Roman alphabet in the 20th century. In Russia and most parts of the former Soviet Union, the Cyrillic alphabet survives to the present day. Let you read the reverberations. Mission to Slavs. The Cyrillic alphabet stimulated conversions to Orthodox Christianity. Missionaries translated to the Christian scriptures and church rituals into Slavonic and Cyrillic writing, helped them explain Christian values and ideas in Slavic terms. Meanwhile, schools organized by missionaries ensured that Slavs would receive religious instruction alongside their introduction to basic literacy. As a result, Orthodox Christianity deeply influenced the cultural traditions of many Slavic peoples. Byzantine and Russia. North of Bulgaria, another Slavic people began to organize large states. The Russians, about mid-9th century Russians, created several principalities governed, deeply influenced from... Oh, I'm so sorry. I got lost. I will go ahead and pause that. Governed from thriving trading centers, notably Kiev, strategically situated on the Dnieper River along the main trade route linking Scandinavia and the Byzantine. Kiev became a wealthy and powerful center, and it dominated much of the territory between the Volga and Dnieper. From the 10th to the 13th century, Russian merchants visited Constantinople in large numbers and became well acquainted with Byzantine society. Russian princes sought alliances with the Byzantine rulers and began to express an interest in Orthodox Christianity. I'm going to zoom in on this. I didn't realize this was a full page of the reverberations. So should you want to pause so that you can read the entire article. There we go. Sorry about that. The conversions of Prince Vladimir. About 989, Prince Vladimir Kiev converted to Orthodox Christianity and ordered his subjects to follow his example. After his conversion, Byzantine influences flowed rapidly into Russia. Cyrillic writing, like literacy, and Orthodox missions all spread quickly throughout Russia. Byzantine teachers traveled north to establish schools, and Byzantine priests conducted services for Russian converts. For 2 centuries, Kiev served as a conduit for the spread of Byzantine cultural and religious influence in Russia. Indeed, Byzantine art and architecture dominated Kiev and other Russian cities. This keeps going out of focus. The onion domes that were our distinctive feature of early Russian churches were the result of architects' efforts to initiate the dome structures of Constantinople using wood as their principal building material. The growth of Kiev. A princes of Kiev established firm sacerdotal repopulist, I cannot pronounce that to save my life today, control over the Russian Orthodox Church, so called to distinguish it from the Eastern Orthodox Church of the Byzantine Empire. They also drew inspiration from the Byzantine legal tradition and compiled a written law code for their lands. By controlling the trade with Byzantine and other lands, they gained financial resources to building a flourishing society. Eventually, Russians even claimed to inherit the imperial mantle of Byzantine. According to a popular theory of the 16th century, Moscow was the world's third Rome. The first Rome had fallen to Germanic invaders in the 5th centuries, whereas the second Rome, Constantinople, had fallen to the Turks 1,000 years later. Moscow survived as the third Rome, the cultural and religious beacon that would guide the world to Orthodox Christian righteousness. Inspired by that theory, missionaries took their Russian Orthodox faith to distant lands. Thus, long after the collapse of Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine legacy continued to work its influence through the outward reach of the Russian Orthodox Church. here is this. And that is the end of part 3, chapter 10 for World Traditions and Encounters. Thank you.